For almost a decade, a single phrase dominated one of the most contentious trade negotiations in modern British political history. Not tariffs, not steel, not cars, chicken. Specifically, chlorinated chicken, and the fight over whether it would ever be allowed onto British supermarket shelves became one of the clearest, most public examples of what Brexit actually meant in practical, dinner table terms for millions of people who had never given a moment's thought to poultry processing before 2016. This video is about what chlorinated chicken actually is, why the EU banned it decades before anyone had heard the phrase in a political context, why the US does it differently, and how, after years of political brinkmanship, the UK government actually resolved this specific question in 2025. Let's start with what's actually happening to the chicken, because the phrase itself makes it sound more alarming and in some ways more mysterious than the underlying process really is. In the United States, poultry processing facilities are permitted to use what regulators call pathogen reduction treatments, antimicrobial washes applied to chicken carcasses at the end of the slaughter and processing line, specifically to reduce surface bacteria like Salmonella and Campylobacter before the meat is packaged. Chlorine-based rinses are one of several approved treatments under this category, alongside other antimicrobial washes like peracetic acid, all regulated and approved by the United States Department of Agriculture, Food Safety, and Inspection Service. The European Union banned the use of any decontamination substance other than potable water for washing poultry carcasses back in 1997, a prohibition that predates the entire Brexit political saga by nearly 2 decades. When the UK was still an EU member state, that ban applied automatically. After Brexit, the UK chose to retain it as its own independent food safety standard rather than removing it, a decision that turned out to be one of the most politically loaded regulatory choices Britain has made in the years since leaving the EU. The core disagreement here isn't really about whether chlorine itself, at the concentrations used, poses a meaningful direct health risk to the person eating the chicken. Food safety agencies on both sides of the Atlantic have generally agreed that the specific chlorine wash itself, at approved levels, isn't the primary safety concern. It's worth being precise about this because it's the single most common misunderstanding in how this topic gets discussed publicly. The objection was never really framed by EU or UK regulators as chlorine will poison you. The actual disagreement is about philosophy, what stage of the production process you rely on to guarantee safety in the first place, and whether relying on that final treatment creates weaker incentives earlier in the chain, where EU regulators have argued the more meaningful food safety and animal welfare protections actually need to live. The EU approach is often described as farm to fork, the idea that food safety has to be built into every stage of production, starting with how densely animals are housed, how slaughter facilities are run, how quickly and at what temperature meat is processed, and how contamination is prevented throughout the entire chain, rather than corrected at the very end. Under this model, a final chemical decontamination wash isn't necessary in the EU's regulatory reasoning, specifically because the hygiene standards earlier in the process are supposed to already keep bacterial contamination low enough that carcasses don't need that final intervention to be safe. The US approach places more regulatory weight on that final pathogen reduction step. Critics of the American system, and this criticism has come from EU food safety officials as well as UK farming and consumer groups, have argued that this endpoint treatment approach can in effect allow lower hygiene standards earlier in the production chain on the theory that a strong enough final wash will compensate for it regardless of what happened upstream. Defenders of the US system, including US agricultural trade representatives, have pushed back hard on that framing, arguing that American poultry processing facilities maintain rigorous hygiene standards throughout production as well, and that the additional pathogen reduction step is a genuine extra layer of consumer protection on top of that, not a substitute for it, comparing it to an added safety margin rather than a shortcut. Neither side is straightforwardly right or wrong here in a way that settles the argument cleanly. It is a genuine difference in regulatory philosophy about where in a long production chain safety should be actively engineered, and reasonable food safety experts on both sides of the Atlantic have defended their own system's underlying logic. Now here's where this stopped being an abstract regulatory comparison and became one of the defining political fights of post-Brexit Britain. Almost immediately after the UK voted to leave the EU in 2016, the question of a future US and UK trade deal became a major political topic. And US agricultural trade groups made clear from early on that expanded access for American poultry and beef, including chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-treated beef, would be a priority in any negotiation. British diplomats and trade officials warned publicly, well before formal negotiations even began, that the Trump administration would push hard on this point as a condition of any broader trade agreement, and UK farming groups, food standards campaigners, and opposition politicians began raising the alarm almost immediately, arguing that accepting these imports would represent Britain trading away its own food safety standards purely for the sake of getting a trade deal done. The phrase chlorinated chicken became genuine shorthand in British media and parliament for a much bigger set of anxieties. Not just about one specific product, but about whether post-Brexit Britain would end up quietly lowering its regulatory standards across the board to satisfy US trade demands in agriculture and potentially well beyond it. It came up repeatedly in parliamentary debates, in general election campaigning, and in ongoing negotiations across multiple UK governments, from the Conservative administrations under Theresa May and Boris Johnson through to the current Labour government under Keir Starmer. At various points, UK trade officials floated compromise proposals, including at one stage a dual-tariff system that would have technically allowed chlorine-washed chicken imports but applied steep tariffs specifically designed to make them commercially unviable for American exporters, a proposal meant to satisfy both sides without either fully winning. That specific compromise never became final policy, but it captures just how much political engineering went into avoiding a straightforward yes or no answer on this question for years. Successive UK governments, facing sustained pressure from British farmers, the National Farmers Union, and consumer groups, repeatedly promised publicly that they would not allow food standards to be weakened in pursuit of a US trade deal, turning the chlorinated chicken question into a specific, testable promise that journalists and opposition politicians could hold each government to at every stage of negotiation. That promise was actually put to the test in May 2025 when the UK and US finally announced a trade agreement under Prime Minister Keir Starmer and President Trump. The deal included significant new market access for American exports, including beef and ethanol, and represented a genuine breakthrough after years of on and off negotiation. But poultry, and specifically chlorinated chicken, was deliberately excluded from the agreement. The UK government explicitly stated it had held firm on what it called red lines regarding food and agricultural standards, and hormone-treated beef and chlorine-washed chicken both remained illegal under UK law even after the deal was signed. UK poultry industry groups publicly welcomed the outcome, describing the omission as a clear signal that the government had backed domestic farming standards over a maximalist trade agreement. The story didn't stop there either. Shortly after the US trade deal, the UK separately reached what's been described as a reset agreement with the EU, specifically covering sanitary and phytosanitary standards, the technical food safety category that covers exactly this kind of issue. Under that agreement, the UK committed to staying dynamically aligned with future EU food safety rules going forward, meaning that as the EU updates its own regulations, the UK will generally follow suit automatically in this specific policy area in exchange for reduced trade friction and paperwork for UK food exports moving into the EU. That reset agreement specifically reaffirmed the chlorinated chicken ban as part of a broader alignment package, which means the UK's position on this specific question is now tied not just to a standalone domestic policy choice, but to its ongoing food safety relationship with the EU as well. It's worth understanding just how early the warnings about this started, because it shapes how long this fight actually dragged on before reaching any resolution. As early as 2018, well before formal US and UK trade talks had even properly begun, a former UK ambassador to Washington publicly warned that the incoming Trump administration would likely play hardball and push hard for the UK to accept American agricultural standards, including chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-treated beef, as a genuine precondition for any broader trade relationship. At the time, some UK trade officials pushed back against that characterization, defending the safety of chlorine-washed poultry and expressing hope that a deal could move quickly. That early disagreement between UK officials who wanted to defend the American system's safety record and those warning it would become a political liability set the tone for years of tension that followed. Chicken was not the only front in this fight either, even though it became the most publicly recognizable one. Hormone-treated beef raised a parallel and, in some ways, longer-running dispute. EU has banned the use of growth-promoting hormones in cattle since the 1980s, well before the poultry chlorine-wash ban, based on its own precautionary food safety reasoning, while US cattle producers have used approved hormone implants as standard practice for decades. And as UK and US trade talks progressed, a third front opened around pork. The National Pig Association specifically pushed for the same kind of firm protection given to chicken and beef, raising concerns about production methods used in parts of the US pork industry, including the use of sow gestation stalls, a housing method that has been banned in the UK since 1999 on animal welfare grounds, but which remains legal and in use in significant parts of US pork production. This was not a fringe concern raised late in the process. It reflects the same underlying tension playing out across an entire category of UK agricultural policy, not a single isolated fight over one product. That pattern is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes what chlorinated chicken was actually standing in for throughout this entire saga. It was never genuinely just about chicken. It became the most memorable, most quotable shorthand for a much broader question British trade negotiators faced across poultry, beef, and pork simultaneously. Whether a series of individual American agricultural production standards, chlorine washing, hormone implants, gestation stalls, and others would be allowed to enter the UK market as the price of a broader trade relationship, or whether the UK would hold each of them to its own pre-existing standard regardless of the cost of trade negotiations. The fact that chicken became the household phrase rather than hormone beef or gestation stalls says more about which phrase stuck in headlines and comedy sketches than about which underlying issue actually mattered most to UK farmers and food safety officials. So, as things stand now, the practical answer to will chlorinated chicken end up on UK shelves is no. It remains banned under UK law. It was explicitly excluded from the 2025 US trade deal, and the UK's separate agreement with the EU has reinforced that position going forward. That does not mean this question is permanently closed forever in a legal sense. Trade policy and international agreements can always be revisited by future governments, but as of the most recent developments, nearly a decade of political fighting over this specific phrase ended with the UK holding its pre-Brexit standard in place rather than adopting the US approach. It is worth stepping back and noting what this whole saga actually demonstrates about the broader theme of this channel. Chlorinated chicken was never really about chlorine in the same way most of what we have covered on this channel was never really just about a single chemical or ingredient. It was about which country's regulatory philosophy, precautionary farm-to-fork prevention versus endpoint treatment and control, a newly independent Britain would choose to align itself with once it was free to make that choice on its own, outside the EU's regulatory umbrella entirely. The fact that the UK, given a genuine choice, chose to keep the EU aligned standard rather than adopt the US one tells you something real about where British food policy has actually landed, even after all the years of uncertainty about which direction it might go. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including USD, Food Safety and Inspection Service documentation, EU poultry hygiene regulation dating to 1997, and public statements and agreements from UK government and trade officials. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Trade agreements and regulatory alignment can change over time, so always check current official sources for the latest developments. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any government, trade body, or company mentioned. Next time, we're back in the fast food drive-thru comparing McDonald's own published ingredient lists, country by country, and the preservatives and processing aids hiding in the US fries formulation that don't appear in several European versions of the exact same product. Subscribe if you want to see exactly what is different in the fryer.